Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for Science Division Live. Today, we're talking about turning Colorado's rocks upside down with the Tim and Catherine Ryan, curator of geology, Dr. James Hagedorn here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. My name is Talia. I'm part of the Greater Virtual Experiences team. I haven't done one of these in a little while, so I'm extra excited to be your host today. The lovely and wonderful Memory Williams is enjoying a little bit of time off today, so I'm filling in. So some big shoes to fill, but we're going to have a good time, and I'm excited to learn about rocks because let's be real, geology rocks. All right, so today, I know I'm full of terrible jokes like that. Today, Dr. James Hagedorn has an exciting presentation for us all about some of the rocks in geology in Colorado. It's sort of a photo journey through our state and back in time, because that's really what rocks allow us to do, is kind of travel back in time and look at ancient worlds. And today we're going to hear from him first and then take your questions from all of you. So if you're watching today on Facebook, leave us a comment, say hello, let us know where you're watching from today, and same to anybody watching on YouTube. My big job today is going to be to monitor those streams on my handy dandy device and get ready to pull your questions at the end of our presentation. So stay tuned. We will answer those questions in just a little bit. And for now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. James Hagedorn and let him take it away. James, how you doing today?
I'm ready to rock and roll. No pun intended. All right, thanks, Talia. And hey, I just want to give a shout out to Tim, who's behind the scenes there, making some electrons fire your way with some pictures and some data. And I thought it'd be fun today to do a little bit of sharing of deep time geology. And one of the things that people oftentimes ask me when I go look at a rock or we're hiking in a park and they say, and I tell them, oh, well, this was an ancient dune deposit, or wow, these rocks are 280 million years old and they were deposited at the bottom of the ocean. One of the things people ask me is, well, how do you know that, right? How do you know you were at the bottom of the ocean? How do you know you were in a dune or on top of a mountain? And how do we get that? And so today I want to share some work that a bunch of community scientists at the museum and I have been working on for the last couple of years, along with a bunch of folks down in New Mexico and Arizona and other places, where we're basically learning to create ancient maps of what's called the topography. And the topography is the study of the sort of height or depth of the surface of the earth. So a mountain is high, has a high elevation, is high topography. Got lots of that here in Colorado. And in the ocean, you might call it bathymetry, or the depth of the water. Are you in the bottom of a really deep sea, or kind of a shallow bay, or maybe up on the beach? And so we've been trying to work to use rocks here in Colorado and then rocks down in Arizona in the Grand Canyon, which are two awesome geologic laboratories, to figure out what ancient Earth looked like 500 million years ago. And this is kind of a big picture right here. This is an ancient kind of squashed map of the Earth. Here's the equator here. And North America is kind of this oozy looking thing right here. I don't know, I've had scabs on my kids' knees that look a little bit like that. But Colorado is right about here. Grand Canyon's right down here somewhere. And these maps, we create based on looking at rocks and fossils and minerals and other clues in them to determine what environments they represent. And, if you've got a rock and it's got a marine fossil in it, like an ancient fish or a trilobite, it was underwater probably. And if it's got a land dwelling creature on it, whether it be a tree or maybe like a fossilized garden snail, it tells you that you've got land there. There are other clues like that. But one of the things that we have trouble doing in deep time is figuring out how high or how low places are. And I just want to give an example from the Grand Canyon. This is a digital elevation model, or kind of a weird shaded map of what the Grand Canyon looks like today. And this kind of snaky looking thing here that has all these dendritic or bifurcating structures on it, this is the Colorado River. And all these little things joining it here are other little rivers and streams. And as they kind of head out down to the south and then eventually to the west, and they enter off and they end up in a big lake. And so this is one of the largest holes on the surface of the earth that we can see with our naked eyes. What we can do with these types of maps, which are shaded based on the depth or height, if you will, above the surface of the earth, above sort of an average point like sea level where the beach is that we can then make renderings of them. And this is just a model I pulled off the web here of a canyon system where it shows the relative height and depth of different features in here. The bottom of a canyon where the river's cutting down, and some side walls and some mesas and buttes that are a little bit higher up. And so this has been shaded, and it allows us to get a sense of like, what does the Grand Canyon look like today, right? It's a big hole in the ground. And by the way, it's got lots of cool rocks, which is one of the reasons I love it. But how do you do that in the past? And so I want to show you some examples today from Colorado and also from the Grand Canyon that give us a sense of how do we make a kind of topographic map or a bathymetric map of ancient Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. And it turns out that I'm working with an amazing team of folks from all over the country trying to figure this out. And I want to just give a shout out to Jen Murdoch, Ginny Gent, Sarah Cowles, and the original Emerald Spindler, who helped get this project started. And what we've been doing together with a team of folks down at University of New Mexico is looking at this one weird surface that's found in rocks all over the world that has basically bumps and hills and divots in it, where there are really hard kind of rocks formed by volcanoes and other processes underneath it. And on top, this surface is filled in with layered sedimentary rocks like those right here that filled in depressions, or in some cases, lapped up on ancient highs that were present on the surface of the Earth 500 million years ago. And so let's just take a closer look at one of these here. This is this kind of hard, bumpy surface here. It's called the Great Unconformity. And it's something that geologists around the world have found on every continent. And you've probably got one in your very own backyard too. And on this surface, you can see that there are layered sedimentary rocks. These are sands, ancient beach sands and dune sands that are building up layer by layer, filling in this depression. And these layers lap up onto, or sort of slightly grade up onto this little hill over here. So this is an ancient hill, and this is a depression. This might have been a bay. I mean, can you imagine going back 500 million years ago and like walking off the beach over here on the left and kind of entering the water and maybe snorkeling out over the bay here? Well, that's kind of what we're trying to do in deep time, is to figure out how to reconstruct where there were hills and valleys and mountains and canyons, and how did they get there? And it turns out that when you look at rocks, there's lots of clues in those rocks. And as detectives in deep time, we like to bring those clues together to figure out what landscapes look like. And so here's an example of a bunch of old, kind of ugly looking squashed rocks on the bottom that formed a little bit of a hill. And then these layered sedimentary rocks, this is from the Grand Canyon, just built right up over the top of it. So this is a fossilized hill, basically. It's a big bump. You know, if this was exposed in Boulder, Colorado, people would be climbing on it and belaying from the top, probably. Here's an example from Colorado. This is down near Cave of the Winds. And there are other places where you look at this surface, and Jen is kind of joking with her hands here, but the surface back here is almost perfectly flat. So here's a place where the ancient topography was pretty flat and subdued, maybe like eastern Colorado or parts of Kansas or Iowa. And what's interesting is that these surfaces at this Great Unconformity are preserved all over the Earth. Here's an example from Glenwood Canyon in Colorado, where we've got layered sedimentary rocks built up on top of looks like a fossilized hill or a mountain here. Here's an example from New York, where a student's walking along a road and this surface is perfectly flat. So it's basically no topography at all. Here's one from Jordan. There's a little truck down here for scale. And here's a fossilized hill, if you will, of ancient igneous or volcanically derived rocks, with these sedimentary rocks just filling in a valley to the side of it. And so these structures exist all over the world, but it's oftentimes kind of hard to figure out, other than just getting a snapshot of one place, what did the landscape look like? Like if we could have a time travel helicopter and fly over an ancient landscape and look down, what would it look like? Well, one way to gather the data to do that is to go out in the field and measure the thicknesses of rocks that fill in depressions, and thicknesses of rocks that are lapping up on top of high points. And if you think about it, the rocks will be thinner up on the ancient highs, or on the ancient hills, or maybe the ancient islands if we're in a marine basin. And they'll be thicker in areas where there was a depression, like a bay, or on land, a valley. So we can go out and measure sections on this, but man, it takes a long time. And places where you need to measure rocks tend to be in mountains or giant canyons or places that are pretty steep, and it's a lot of work. So we do that as geologists, but what happens when you get to a place like this? This is Deep Creek Overlook, Deep Creek Canyon in Colorado, and I'm standing on one side of it, and you can see there's a bunch of kind of grotty looking, kind of punky looking rock on the bottom, and then these layered sedimentary rocks on top. And if you look carefully at this picture, you'll see that some places the layered sedimentary rocks are kind of thick, and other places they're kind of thin, as they get built up on top of this ancient landscape. And so one of the ways we can do this is we can go out and measure the thickness of the rocks at a lot of places, but we can also use a geologic map. And luckily, the geologic maps of the US and many other countries are pretty good. All the different colors on this map represent the different rock units that people have kind of painted on here, like kind of like the guardrails on the highway or the little markings on the side of the highway. And so I'm going to zoom in on this little canyon right here just to illustrate this. And so in this case, the rocks that cap this unconformity, look, X marks the spot. Maybe there's pirate treasure there, eh? Matey? These rocks that go right over the top of it here, the Sawatch sandstone in this case, are layered. And what's cool is that we know the thickness of the Sawatch. We can actually measure it off of an ancient map from our living rooms. I know you're thinking this is pandemic style geology, right? But we can measure it by measuring these stripes on here. These stripes are actually the lines of present day elevation. And these lines tell us what the higher points are in modern times, and the deeper the low, and the lines tell us, you know, what's deeper or closer to sea level as they go down. And so in this case, I can count the lines here. So I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 lines of thickness of the Sawatch here. So from my living room with you just here right now, while my son's playing Minecraft, we just figured out that the Sawatch is 7 or 8 lines thick. And each of those lines is about, 40 feet in thickness, let's say. And so that means that the Sawatch here is, on the order of hundreds of feet thick at this particular location. And so we can do this for lots of different places on geologic maps and create a database of how these rocks filled in the ancient lows and lapped up on the highs. But we want to check this. We don't want to just use digital data from a map. We want to go out and check it. And one of the things we've been doing is augmenting this work with digital rangefinder, laser rangefinders, where you take one of these little gadgets that uses a laser to shoot off of a cliff. And I can go back to a place like the Grand Canyon or Deep Creek, Colorado, next to Glenwood Canyon. And I can shoot this laser a mile or two up or across a canyon and measure the height of the top of the rock. And I can measure the bottom of the rock and get a thickness. And I can do that dozens of times, much faster than I could with by hiking up there and measuring it with a stick, like a geologist's version of a yardstick. And so we've done exactly this. We've gone out and measured sections the sort of classical, traditional way. We've used geological maps to extrapolate the thickness of the rocks. And then we've gone out and checked these things and filled in gaps with this digital laser rangefinder. And here's me pointing at a part of the rock here that I just sighted off of and figured out the thickness of. And you can almost see that this rock is thicker where my fingers are than over here on the right, where it thins on top of an ancient, gosh, what was that? Maybe it was a paleo hill. So we've done this on the other side of the canyon. Here's a place where the rocks are a little bit thinner here and maybe thicker over on the right. So we do this at lots of different places and can capture a data set that we put together. And don't worry, I'm not going to read you this spreadsheet, but a lot of science involves a tremendous amount of data. And so we use spreadsheets to put in lots of data and to calculate the geometry and the thicknesses and the orientation of measurements that we make in the field and that we make in the lab. And so we've done this with hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of places. And I just want to show you some of the preliminary data that we're piecing together, in this case, from the Grand Canyon. So here's again that kind of crazy looking shaded map of the Grand Canyon with the modern canyon superimposed here, Colorado River zooming down here. This is the little Colorado coming in on the side. If any of you've been there, it's a spectacular place to dunk your head in the water, or your feet, or your whole body for that matter. And these little green dots here are places where we've digitally measured the thickness of these rocks that sit on top of this Great Unconformity surface at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, just like the ones I showed you from Colorado and in pictures earlier. And from that, we can then kind of like connect the dots. You guys ever done those? Remember those diagrams you did as a kid where you connected the dots or you shaded the areas in between things? We can actually shade the different thicknesses of these rocks at different points. And we create what's called an isopack map. And I'm just going to show you one of those right now. And so we turn this information into this wild and crazy psychedelic diagram. And this diagram, I'm just going to back up here, is constructed by interpreting or kind of calculating the distances between all of these other places where we have data to try to figure out what's there and what's in between. And the areas in bright colors here correspond to the thickness of the rocks that overlie this great unconformity, a rock unit, in this case known as the Tapeats sandstone. And in this case, the scale is over on the right, and this is in feet. So areas where the rocks are thick are yellow or red, and those are hundreds of feet thick. And areas where the rock is really thin, this blanketing rock that's kind of covering like a frosting, this bumpy surface of ancient topography, where it's really thin, it's blue. So in this case, this is only tens of feet. And then green is somewhere in between. And so as we look at this diagram, we can tell a little bit about what the ancient landscape looks like. And that's because as you look at this with me right now, you are getting an airplane window view of what the Great Unconformity looked like 500 million years ago. As you look down, the areas in red and yellow, these are valleys and bays and areas that are depressions where the rock built up thick because there was a hole for it to fill it, for the sediments to fill into. Where are the hills or the islands? That's right, they're in blue. And so those are areas where the rock couldn't build up because there was a high point there. So it only built up a little bit of this rock unit on top. And what we're trying to do now, the blue stripes on here are modern streams. The red lines that jig-jag through here, these are actually fractures in the surface of the earth called faults, where the earth is actually moving up or down or side by side with one another and maybe triggering some earthquakes in the process. But isn't it interesting to see that some of the rivers, the modern rivers in the canyon, are following these big fault systems where the crust of or the outer layer of the earth is broken? But what's cool is it seems that some of the ancient topography might be related to these faults as well. And so that's an area that some colleagues down at the University of New Mexico are trying to figure out right now, is to what extent was the ancient surface of the earth on top of the Great Unconformity driven by plate tectonics and other factors? And you'll have to tune in another day to get the answer to that question, because we're working towards that right now. But our hope is to try to figure out, what did the earth look like during this Great Unconformity event? And where were the peaks and where were the valleys? And what was underwater and what was on land and then what was in between? Anyways, thanks for tuning in, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation. I am just always amazed by the sheer number of adventures that your science takes you on. I am always impressed every time. I feel like you and I run into each other, the water cooler back in the before times, not so much now that we're all working from home. But I'd always ask you, what have you been up to, James? And you'd say, oh, just climbing mountains and finding this. And I looked at these old rocks, and you've always got so many cool stories from the work that you get to do. So with that, I think a lot of people are curious about some of your stories and some of the things that you're working on. And we'll go ahead and jump into some questions. So as a reminder, folks, my name is Talia. I'm part of the Virtual Experiences team here at the museum. My role today is to take your questions from the Facebook comments and the YouTube comments and send them to our expert today. So keep those coming. I do see a few already. I know James loves questions, and he especially loves really, really hard questions. James also has a very cute dog wagging his way behind him.
Dash back here. If Dash doesn't, if I can't give you the answer, Dash will give you the answer.
There you go.
He's very friendly, and he loves rocks, mostly peeing on them though.
Yeah. That sounds about right. My dog will occasionally carry a little rock around in his mouth. He never swallows it. He just likes to pick them up and carry them. I don't know why. It's adorable. I will never question it. All right, let's talk about science now. First question up from Sarah. Sarah, again, thinking about adventures, not to reduce your hiking opportunities, but do you think you might be able to use things like drone technology to measure some of this thickness? Or what are some advancements that you could see coming that might make your job a little bit easier?
Well, drone work would be fantastic, actually, because then we could precisely measure the thicknesses of rocks and actually trace along the surface itself, right? It's actually, look at the picture behind Talia right now. That's Black Canyon in the Gunnison. That's in Colorado. I believe that's the second deepest canyon in the United States, or close to it. And that is just a ridiculously hard cliff to get up and down, and much less move along the sides of laterally. And so drones could be really helpful with that. Currently, drones are not allowed in a lot of national parks for safety and other reasons, which is totally understandable. Also for debris and trash purposes, because a lot of them end up on the ground. But that's something that that could really help. And the types of maps that I showed you earlier, geologic maps, even in the last 10 years, have only just started to become digital at a level of resolution where we can use them in this way. I mean, 10 years ago, I could not have done this project the way I just showed you now. Neither could anyone else on the team, because the maps were just getting to that level of resolution. And so I think drones, together with field-based checking and calibration of that with what's called a Jacob staff or a laser rangefinder or a combo, is really a way of the future. At the end of the day, you have to know the rocks, and you have to be able to pick what's called the contacts, right? And so that means you have to have gone and looked at a lot of rocks in person. You can't do that digitally, right? You can't do it with a photo, right? So the drone or a laser rangefinder still has to be guided by someone with a geological background in that area or that time or whatever the problem is. But man, I think that could be really empowering. And I would love help learning how to do more of that, actually, because I'm just learning this myself. Everything you saw today, I mean, never did any of this before, about 2 years ago. So
yeah, a lot of the work that I do here at the museum, just in my world, I don't get to talk about rocks all that often, but I get to help other people talk to kids about what they are doing and what they are studying. And I think one thing that really resonates with a lot of kids is the idea that, like, if you like to play video games, or maybe you have a drone or something that you fly at home, that is useful technology. That's a useful skill set that scientists are going to be using more and more in the years to come. So if you have a young learner in your life who maybe really likes playing video games or flying planes or drones or anything like that, tell them to come talk to James, because we're going to need some help. And it's hard to learn how to do. One question I had, actually, if I can be selfish and ask a question, I noticed in some of your photos you were talking about, you have a laser, you have, I see you holding fingers up like this, and it seems like a combination of different methods is really the most effective way to get these kinds of measurements and gather this data. But how effective are each of the methods respectively? Like, how much can you learn from holding your fingers and hands up to rocks?
So the fingers were really just for illustration. I don't actually do that to measure. But what I do in the field, for example, is I will take a picture of my finger on the thing I just measured, because then I have a timestamp on that, and meaning I know when it was taken, and I also have a GPS coordinate or a location. And so it's just an additional way of notating the measurements so that they don't get mixed up. And it also reminds me what I was measuring if I look at it 3 years from now or something and have forgotten what I was doing that one day on that cliff. But you're right, there's a combo of techniques. So measuring things on the ground is always the most accurate. There is no geologic map or digital rangefinder that I haven't seen a geologist be able to beat by an order of magnitude. That said, the error bars in measuring a section or measuring a thickness by a human is typically, let's say, between a bunch of geologists, less than 1 to 5%, right? The error bars doing it digitally on a map or doing it with a laser rangefinder get upwards to, I'd say, more. If you've done it a lot, you can get it probably to 10%, right? 5 or 10%. And so a 10% error, well, that's the difference between an A and a B, right? Or a B and a C. On the other hand, think about the spatial scale, right? If I'm measuring something that's 100 feet thick, but it's 50 miles wide, that error of 10 feet doesn't make that much of a difference, right? Because I'm looking at something that's so big, right? I'm just trying to see, is there a valley or is there a mountain range, right? Versus the details of the valley and the details of the mountain range. So I think if we are aware of the relative scale of the features we're looking at, the combo of these things works really well. And it's only going to get better. So that's the bright news, right? I mean, digital maps, for example, in Glenwood Canyon, which is near where her photo background is, or your photo background is, we had a lot of fires there last year, and they were really bad. But as a result, and actually as a result of previous fires there, they have used satellites and drones and airplanes and other techniques to make super high resolution maps of those areas to help with fire protection and mitigation and things like that. And so what's cool for us is that we can actually use those for other science too, right? And so those maps are kind of helping out society, both in terms of science, but also in terms of like practical issues and safety. So, and that's something that wouldn't have happened if that area hadn't been prone to fires.
So it's a mix of, really fancy advanced technology and some of your more, analog field methods. I was thinking about some of those field tricks, where like you can hold fingers up between the thumb or the sun and the horizon and kind of gauge how long it is until the sun disappears and you run out of light. Good to know that this is just a handy reference point for it's about this thick when I look at it in my camera. It's interesting to think about this thick versus this thick. I don't know. It's about the size of my thumb. That's science too. All right, I see another question from Scott on YouTube. He's wondering, what are some of the main theories as to the causes of the Great Unconformity? And a great comment from Mina on Facebook saying that the Great Unconformity is their pro wrestler name, which, I wish I had thought of that.
Could you say that last comment? I didn't quite hear you.
Mina commented that the Great Unconformity is their pro wrestler name.
Awesome. I love it.
I wish I had thought of that.
Super.
High fives to
talk about getting it tangled. So the Great Unconformity, it turns out, is a lot of things, and there have been a lot of theories to explain it. What it is a giant erosional event where for millions, and in some cases hundreds of millions, in a couple places more than 1 billion years, that's a quarter of our planet's duration, has been exposed and being weathered and eroded and beaten down and had lichen eating it and maybe soils etching it and wind blasting it and rivers cutting through it and waves bashing on it and all the other things that happen on the surface of the earth. And that surface is mostly underlain by rocks that are pretty darn hard and pretty darn resistant and are kind of what's left, right? And so the what's left on that surface is really something that needed a protective layer of frosting or armor on it to clad it before we could even recognize it. And so early in, let's say what's called the Phanerozoic, the last 500 or 600 million years of Earth history, there were a series of very large flooding events that blanketed almost every continent on Earth with piles of sand. And those first blanketing events, one of which is called the Sauk sequence or the Sauk transgression, right? Oh, that would be a cool wrestling name too, right? Here comes the Great Unconformity versus the Sauk transgression. So anyways, the Sauk transgression got on top and pinned the Great Unconformity, right? In wrestling parlance, squashed them. The ref sort of said, and you're out. And guess what? There was never a Great Unconformity after that. Not one that was as great as the original, right? And essentially what happened was that blanketed that surface and coated it. And then after that, with every subsequent rise in sea level or lowering of the continents, that surface got a little bit more sediment piled onto it and a little bit more and a little bit more, kind of like building up layers of paint on a house. They protect it more and more over time. So yeah, that was the countdown for that surface. And so it's really just a giant gap in time, but it was a long gap in time. And we've got it right here in Colorado. So
Colorado is a geologist's dream.
It's actually it's not quite in view behind Talia's head there, but it's kind of like over the hill from behind there. It's actually present in that region. So
everybody has to go pay to visit once it's safe to go traveling around. Well, thanks to Mina for catalyzing a really incredible series of wrestling metaphors. I bet you didn't come here today thinking that that's what you would be hearing from us when we talked about this, everybody watching, but it's what you got, and you're welcome. We have time for a few more questions, I think. Patrick is wondering, why is the Great Unconformity longer at some places than in others? And how does this impact your findings? So it sounds like there's maybe some irregularity.
There he is. Well, I'm going to use my arm right here to kind of illustrate something. Actually, I'm going to tilt it like, how am I going to do it? I'm going to tilt my arm like this, right? So if you can imagine the area on your screen here, this is all underwater, right? Like here is sea level, right? Where my right hand is, this hand right here. So these are the waves. They're hitting the beach right over here. And up here, there's kind of like a hill and maybe some mountains. But, down here, this is underwater, right? Well, what happens through time is that this surface represented by my arm right here, which let's say, here's the beach. Maybe there's like a little hill here, there's a valley, and then there's a mountain range right here. So if sea level's right here, right now, let's see if I can do this. Sea level's right here, right now, and this is the Great Unconformity surface. This is the surface that we're mapping, right? We want to know, what did this look like? It probably didn't look like my hand, but I'm giving it a go, right? So as sea level rises, so here I am at time 1, right? And then a couple million years later, sea level's rising more, and it's more, and now I'm at time 2 or 3, and time 4, and time 5, and then and then it floods this valley here. Isn't that so awesome? So now I got a layer of frosting in the valley, right? Time 6, time 7, time 8, right? So now the age of the rock up here that's deposited is younger than the rock that was originally deposited here, right? These are layered rocks. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's the basic idea. So the surface right here where my fingers are lapping onto might be time 1. That might be 510 million years ago. And that's 509, 508, 507, 506, right? And there are places where the time difference from here to here is 300 million years, because this flooding event petered out, and then it kind of regressed, and it petered out, regressed. So there, depending on where you are, that's one way to think about that. The other thing is that, guess what? This part of the equation doesn't really stay in the same place. And that's because we have plate tectonics going around on the surface of the Earth. And so continents are bashing into one another and colliding. And so sometimes this surface is actually rising up. And sometimes it's actually sinking because it's getting, I don't know if I could do this without breaking my shoulder off in some crazy wrestling move. But the surface of the Earth is actually sinking in places because it's getting crushed. And an analogy for this is that if you take a carpet that's on a wood floor or smooth floor, and you push it on one side, that carpet goes up in places, and other places it goes down, right? It goes up and it goes down, right? And so the continents are a little bit like that. There are places on the continents where they get pushed up, and other places where they actually kind of sink down. And so at the same time, sea level might be going up or down, the continent might be going up or down too. And so you can get places where the sedimentary rocks that blanket that ancient surface, for it to take 200 or 300 or 500 million years for it to actually get there, right? Because the continent's going up and sea level isn't going up as fast, or because other things are happening.
Yeah, there's a lot going on this dynamic planet of ours. And Estelle says, excellent visuals. Thank you for sharing these ways to understand. I do have to give you a compliment. You always come up with really creative ways to explain these sometimes difficult to grasp concepts like deep time. I remember the time that you explained to me how the Flatirons formed by like ripping a piece of paper into tiny little pieces. And you know what? It made sense. I don't know if I could explain it, but that's why you're the curator of geology and I'm not.
I'm the paper ripper-upper.
There you go. There you go. All right. I think I have one final question for you, and then it's time for us to sign off and get back to doing some science today. You said you've got a kiddo behind you playing Minecraft, sitting at the kitchen table.
That's right.
Does having a geologist for a dad help them out at all?
I don't know. Some people will tell you it's a curse. Dad, you're always explaining what those rocks are. Dad, are you doing that old dusty stuff again? No, it's fun. I think the thing about being a scientist, I would say, not just a geologist, that's pretty interesting is that some of us are still kids inside, because we're really, a scientist is just someone who's pursues their curiosity, right? And everyone out there, you, me, our kids, our grandparents, everybody has curiosity. It's innate. And if you pursue it, whether you're thinking about something in your garden, or a scientific problem in deep time, or I wonder why such and such is happening, or so-and-so thinks that way, that process is really the pursuit of curiosity. And we all have that ability in us. And then we just need to learn some information to clad it and base it on to ground our investigative thinking. And that investigative thinking basically ends up being what scientists do. It's the process of science. Science is a verb.
Science is a verb. I feel like we need to put that on like a t-shirt or a bumper sticker and sell it in the gift shop, because we science, you science, he, she, me, they science, we all science. I love it.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. I think it is about time for us to sign off and say goodbye. But thank you so much, James, for spending some time talking to us today. Always fascinating to learn from you. Thank you to everybody who watched on YouTube and Facebook and left some comments, left us some jokes. We are always delighted to get to hear from you and learn a little bit about what you're interested in. So with that, everybody, go out there and prove us right that science is a verb. Go out in science, go pursue some curiosity today, whether that's, you know, why does my dog like the red toy and not the green toy? Or what happens if I put 17 eggs in a cake? I don't know. Do that and then tell us the answer, because I kind of want to know now. Go out there in science, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in.
See you, everybody. Thank you.